In March 1985, Terry Anderson was swept up in the violent conflict of a turbulent era. At the mercy of Shiite captors for nearly 7 years, he lived in chains, wondering fearfully if each day would be his last. But his spirit soared beyond captivity, and he never gave up, nor did those who loved him. And now a free man again, he tells the harrowing and poignant story of a hostage's survival and final triumph in his book, Den of Lions, a startling memoir of survival and triumph. So please welcome our guest, Terry Anderson. Hello, Terry.
Good morning.
Now, tell me what got you to become a hostage. What were you doing in that neck of the woods?
I was a correspondent, actually chief Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press in the Middle East. And the war in Lebanon was at its height, and I was covering it. And the radical Shiite militia was in the process of kidnapping quite a number of foreigners, and I happened to be one of them. I became a journalist because I had served as a Marine correspondent in Vietnam, combat correspondent for the Marine Corps. And after I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps, I left and became a civilian journalist, first in radio and television, and then eventually for the Associated Press, the largest news organization in the world. And they sent me to Asia and then to Africa and then finally to the Middle East to cover the very long Lebanon war. Lasted 16 and a half years.
Around that time, many in the United States were aware of journalists being kidnapped and in some cases beheaded. Now, but what frightened you the most during your time there when you became captive? And how did you become a captive? How were you ambushed?
What frightened me the most? Well, as a former Marine and having covered some pretty bad violence in Asia and Africa before I went to the Middle East, there wasn't much that scared me. And that was the problem. I went out on the streets during a civil war too many times, did not take care of my personal safety to the point I should have, and I was caught. I was kidnapped by one of the most radical of the militia groups that were plaguing Lebanon at the time. Then I got scared because not so much that the hostage takers would kill us, although they threatened that at frequent intervals, but mostly that we would die of neglect or of illness, or that one of the young guards would accidentally fire his weapon and kill us. That happened actually several times. They actually had accidental discharges in our vicinity. One of them almost got me while I was lying on the bed, simply by being a careless young man. And that was kind of scary. I never did believe that they would actually shoot us, although they did. They traded 4 hostages to another radical group, which executed them because of Reagan's attack on Libya, if you remember that.
Mm.
And other hostages died of illness while they were there. There were a total of, probably nearly 100 hostages taken by various groups during that time, although the one that held me named itself Islamic Jihad, which was simply a label that they adopted, was the largest and most prolific of the kidnappers.
Now, did they view you as a combatant, or did they know you were a journalist?
Well, they knew I was a journalist, but they are from an area where most journalists are considered to be spies. So they looked at me as an American spy. Anybody who goes around asking difficult questions in the middle of a war, to them, is more likely to be a spy than an objective journalist. That was one of the reasons they kidnapped me, but probably the strongest reason they kidnapped me was because I made myself available. I wasn't hiding away. I was out on the street trying to cover the war. And they were in the business of kidnapping people, mostly Westerners, to try to trade for some of their people who were prisoners, who had been arrested in Kuwait, and they wanted to get them out of prison.
Now, we've often read how captive journalists and others have been moved around from location to location to kind of minimize anybody trying to obtain their release. So
Yes.
Is that what happened to you, or were you kept pretty much in the same spot?
I was moved some 21 times around Lebanon. Lebanon's a very small country. It's only 38 miles wide and 120 miles long. And it's it's a unique country because it has two mountain ranges running down the length of it, which makes it easy to figure out pretty much where you are, even if you're blindfolded. The terrain is recognizable. So I knew in general where I was kept, mostly in Beirut, in South Lebanon, and then finally out in the Bekaa Valley at an old army barracks. Was kept the last couple of years there. So they moved me around. They would tape us up from head to toe in that shipping tape, that plastic shipping tape that you see all the time, and then put us under the bed of a truck or in the trunk of a car and drive us to the new place, usually through the dark hours of the night. Not a very pleasant experience, I can tell you.
So how many others were you with in your group?
Over the years, probably a dozen, but there was a small group of about 5 of us who were most often together during those 7 years. They would take us from place to place, and then they would put us all in cells next to each other, or in later years, all in 1 or 2 cells. And we got to know each other pretty well, being chained up next to each other. I was the last one of the group to be released, the last American hostage held in Lebanon.
So how did you obtain your release, and what happened to the other guys? Where are they today?
A very fine and brave man named John Domenico Pico, who was the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, risked his own life repeatedly to come to Lebanon, allow himself to be kidnapped so he could meet our captors and try to convince them that they were no longer going to get anything for us, and that it was time to end the very long hostage incidents. And eventually he did. We were released over the space of about 1.5 years, one by one. And I finally was released in December of 1995.
Well, where did they take you? Presumably you needed a medical exam and treatment for all kinds of things.
Once or twice they took a hostage to see a doctor, and once they brought another hostage who was a doctor in to see us, but mostly you didn't get any medical care. You got sick. Some people died. There was a French hostage who died, and there were some others who died of illness. Conditions were, as you can imagine, pretty primitive.
When you were released, where did they take you?
They took me to Damascus, to the Foreign Ministry for press conference, and then to the U.S. Embassy. I was flown to Wiesbaden, West Germany, to a military hospital, and given a complete physical, and outfitted with new clothes and glasses and things like that, and then flown back to the States to meet the rest of my family. My wife and daughter had met me at the Syrian embassy, the U.S. embassy in Syria.
Boy, what was it like in meeting your daughter who had grown during the 6 years?
I never met her before. She was born 3 months after I was taken.
Jeez.
So she was 6.5 when I met her that night that we finally arrived at the U.S. embassy in Damascus. And I remember she was a very sleepy young girl, and she wasn't quite sure what was happening around her, but I picked her up and held her, and it was very emotional.
Jeez, I can imagine. So what happened to your life when you got home and you tried to reintegrate yourself back into the
Well,
environment?
this was the second time I had been through that reintegration process. I came home from Vietnam in 1970, went on recruiting duty in Des Moines, Iowa. And my last year in the Marine Corps, finally got my dress blues that I've been longing for since boot camp. I joined the Marine Corps when I was 17, straight out of high school. And people were spitting at us and burning flags and having demonstrations against our recruiting efforts. And it was all very unpleasant. So I left the Marine Corps. I got out and I went to college and began working as a civilian and journalist. It was not a good time to be an ex-Marine or an ex-Vietnam veteran in America. It wasn't until I came home from Lebanon, after my release as a hostage, that I finally went through that welcome home period that was going on in America at the time in the 90s. And I was welcomed to Washington by Jan Scruggs, the head of the Vietnam Veterans of America. And actually, I was given a very enthusiastic and emotional welcome home, both from Vietnam and from Lebanon at the same time. And it was pretty spectacular. Everybody was supportive. Everybody was trying to help us. Very different from that first welcome home from Vietnam.
When veterans arrive home nowadays after deployment, they often face a lot of challenges. So what do you think is the most important one that they need and they face?
Remember, a lot of those veterans are very young men. And their experience is limited mostly to the time they spend in the military, a very regimented and orderly kind of place with lots of support in the military. And then you get out and you're pretty much on your own. You don't have that support network. You don't have that orderly society around you. And it's difficult to cope, especially if, as many of our veterans do, you have other difficulties, PTSD, or illnesses that were contributed to by combat service that you might have undergone. So it's a difficult task to get yourself straightened out and reconnected to ordinary society. Most veterans do it. Remember, being a military veteran is a growth experience for most young men. They learn about themselves and what they're capable of. They're given a sense of discipline, self-discipline. So most of them come home and they manage this difficult transition. Many of them don't. Many of them can't. I work now for the Rumschock Foundation, and I encountered these veterans who are still having difficulties adapting, reintegrating. The VA is a wonderful place, and they have wonderful doctors and nurses, but the requirements for receiving aid from many veterans groups are sometimes difficult to handle. A lot of paperwork involved, and you need to reach out, and the VA, because of the limits on its funding, doesn't have the capability of actively reaching out to veterans in difficulty. They have to contact the VA, and that's often an experience that they just can't handle. They need help. They need support. Just as we needed it when we came home from Vietnam and we didn't get it because America was a different place. And now there are many groups available to help veterans, and many often government-funded organizations that can help, but the veteran still has to take the initiative. Has to somehow get himself together in a world that he's finding trouble, or she is finding trouble coping with. So they need people who will reach out to them, who will reach out to them and encourage them. I have one veteran I talked to who just couldn't bring himself to ask for help because somehow or other to him it was like charity. It was like a weakness. And I had to convince him through various conversations, no, this is not charity. You earned this. This is part of the contract you had with America. You risked your life for this country, and what you get in return is support when you need it. So you're entitled to this. And I finally convinced him that it was okay to ask for help. And that is the case that many people working with veterans run into.
One of the horrible statistics is the suicide rate among veterans, both for men and women. It's over 24 a day. It's a horrific statistic.
Yeah, and that is often perhaps as a result of the experiences they went through in combat, but often simply a sense of I can't cope with the world. It's too complicated. Things are too difficult. They need somebody who's willing to reach out to them and help them. And thankfully, unlike 30 years ago, there are people available who can do that. Organizations like the Rumschock Foundation and the VA and others.
Terry, thank you so much for giving us some insight into your personal experience, albeit it's really traumatic for that 6-year period and probably what you suffered after that. And for also giving us some insight into the problems and challenges that other veterans face. So we look forward to your continued support and involvement in the Rumschock Foundation and our project that's just underway in Port Jervis, where we provide housing and employment, canine companionship, transportation, and really an opportunity to grow and thrive among other fellow veterans.
I have been involved in many nonprofits and aid groups over the last 40 or 50 years. this is one of the best. This idea of a veterans village is designed exactly for what veterans need. And it is successful. It's not a dream. It's a reality. We're beginning construction. We've got a site. We've got land for it. And we've got some grants. So it's not just something that somebody thought up and they're trying to do. It's really being done. And it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be great.